Good morning. My name's Chris Curtis. I'm one of the leaders at Orchard Baptist, and this morning we're continuing our series on the Beatitudes. So when Steve said this is what we were going to do, I was actually quite pleased, because I've always thought the Beatitudes are one of those things that transcend churches, a bit like the Lord's Prayer or the Ten Commandments, that they've sort of bled out into the general consciousness of society. But I also found, do you know what? I don't actually understand what they mean. I mean, is this something we should be aspiring to? And if that's the case, I didn't see anybody else doing it, and I've got no idea how to do it. And if we're saying that we should be driven by an attitude and that's how we achieve salvation, well, surely that's taking away salvation by faith and through grace. So it did cause quite a problem for me. So I thought I needed to start to investigate. So the first thing I looked at was, what are the circumstances around it? And the circumstances around it are Jesus' teaching. Well, teaching in those times, very different to what we're talking about today. So today, quite often, teaching is all about acquiring facts, information to pass exams or win quizzes. But in Jesus' time, what he was talking about was much more about changing attitudes and belief. You know, nowadays you can go and sit in a lecture. One of my favourite definitions came, a lecture is a transformation of data from the notes of the lecturer to the notes of the student without passing through the minds of either. Now, Jesus was nothing like that. He was about changing beliefs and attitudes, changing the way people looked at the world in his day. So if you take, for example, the rich young ruler. Now, the rich young ruler was wealthy, was well thought of, and in society at the time, they would have thought, yes, he's definitely going to heaven. He's got it made. He's already been blessed by God. That's why he's rich. And Jesus came along and said, no, that's not the way that it works. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He was changing the whole paradigm, the way that people thought. So at the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount, I thought, we're looking at a whole series of teaching, and the Beatitudes, that's where it sits. It also struck me that it's a little bit like 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that wonderful chapter that Paul writes all about love. People frequently read it at weddings, and yes, as it stands alone, it's a lovely chapter, but actually, to really make sense of it, you need to look at chapters 12 and chapters 14 on either side of it, because that's how you understand exactly what Paul is talking about. He's looking at how love fits into spiritual gifts and how we use spiritual gifts in a loving manner to further God's kingdom. And in this instance, we're looking at the Sermon of the Mount. And if we look at it in its entirety, it's almost like Jesus is laying out a manifesto of what the kingdom of heaven can look like on earth. How we can live in a manner to bring heaven to us on earth, to change the way that people act and believe and think. Dallas Willard, who's a very fine American theologian, said, they are explanations and illustrations drawn from the immediate setting of the present availability of the kingdom through personal relationship with Jesus. So the Beatitudes are ways that people can actually contact Jesus, can become members of the kingdom of heaven through that relationship. When I was reading it, it's very brief, very succinct. It's not like Dickens. I mean, Dickens was paid by the word. Initially, Dickens' novels were published piecemeal in a serial. So he can quite happily spend a page and a half describing a glass of water because he's getting paid more money for it. I mean, one of the things that I do a lot at work is to read statements about incidents that have happened. And a statement is a bit like reading this bit of Matthew's Gospel, that Matthew was telling us all the important information, but leaving out some of the background, some of those descriptive details. Now, I was imagining that actually you've got Jesus, and he's got these people that have been healed and have come to see him. You've got the disciples that are sitting at the front of the group. And there's this large crowd around Jesus, hanging on his every word. And he starts to speak, to describe being in relationship with God, what that looks like through him, how that might impact upon our attitudes and behaviours. And when we look at the crowd, the people that Jesus is actually talking to, they're not the rich and the famous. They're not the learned and the scholars. They're actually the common people, the low and the lowly, the broken and the hurting, the marginalised and the lowest in society. The prevailing wisdom is that these people are worthless. These people are not the people that are going to be entering the kingdom of heaven. And I can almost imagine Jesus, when he's starting to introduce the Beatitudes, is almost indicating a group in the crowd and saying, you know, God's blessing upon people who are spiritually bankrupt, people who have no faith, because the kingdom of heaven is available to you, even in that spiritual brokenness. And I think that is what the Beatitudes are all about. I think Jesus is giving us an invitation, give us encouragement. He's not trying to set a standard for people to attain, but he's inviting an encouragement for those who, for example, would be poor in spirit, to be in relationship with him and relationship with God and enter this kingdom of heaven that he's teaching about. The particular beatitude that we're looking at today is blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. I don't know how many of you feel that you've hungered or thirsted for righteousness over the years. Perhaps you've lost a job unfairly. Perhaps you've been blamed for a relationship that's broken down that was not your fault. It can be very difficult to actually overcome that feeling of unjustness and unrighteousness. On the 15th of August 2019, at around midnight, PC Andrew Harper and PC Andy Shaw attended a report of a theft of a quad bike in progress. They turned up, they found a car at the scene with the quad bike attached to the back, and they went to try and detain those people that were responsible for the theft. They jumped into the car and made off, and in the process of doing that, a cord got caught around PC Andrew Harper's leg, and he got dragged for over a mile, being towed behind this car as it was making off. He sustained catastrophic injuries and died at the roadside. Now, I didn't know Andrew Harper personally, but Andy Shaw, his crewmate, is a friend of mine. And Andy found his broken body at the side of the road and sought to try and keep him alive until further help could come. It was a difficult investigation. Lots of people tried to obstruct the investigating officers, but eventually they managed to put together enough evidence to take the case to court. It was at the Old Bailey, and the original trial was cut short because of the COVID pandemic. It's recently been back in court again. There's been lots of problems with it. Allegations of people tampering with the jury. One of the jury members was actually suspended and was seen smiling and waving at the defendants as she left the courtroom. During the trial, the defendants were laughing and joking. Eventually, they were found guilty of manslaughter. Lizzie, Andrew Harper's wife, was distraught. She wrote an open letter looking to have the case retried. That how could a jury not have found the defendants guilty of murder? Looking for a longer sentence. Huge amount of pain and damage to her family. Lizzie Harper is someone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. Many members of Thames Valley Police and the larger police family hunger and thirst for righteousness. Many residents of Wallingford, Andrew's hometown, and Salhampstead, where the bike was stolen, hunger and thirst for righteousness. The local MP, John Howell, is speaking to the Attorney General over the sentence to see whether that's something that should be referred for reconsideration. There's online petitions that the case should be retried, that there should have been a conviction for murder. But all these people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, to see justice done, what will it take for them to be filled? Would a longer sentence? Would a conviction for murder? Probably not. It's unlikely that any action taken by the courts would address that hunger and thirst for righteousness. So that brings us right back to where we were at the beginning. What Jesus is saying to broken people. And I think that in this beatitude, what Jesus is saying is that through a relationship with God, even a lack of justice that seems so monstrous that every atom within your body hungers and thirsts for it to be made right, you can be filled. You can be blessed by God, who can transform the past and make even the most terrible injustices seem insignificant in his greatness. He can restore our souls and fill us with the goodness of righteousness. Amen.